let's get into Romans 15, if you will. The Alliance Church, we're a Christian and Missionary Alliance, and the Alliance Church is all about really missions. I mean, it started as a missionary movement, and still today we're in countries all over the world and being able to reach people for Christ. But even in the midst of that, of God calling us and God is calling you, we come times that we live with shattered dreams. And a lot of times we come up against situations that are sometimes almost unbearable. A lot of times we start to question God, we question our faith, and we're going to have times of hardships, of trials and tribulations. And we have many times of blessing. But there are times when things come our way that sometimes they're just hard waters to swim through. I remember one of the most famous speeches, as we just celebrated Martin Luther King's Day last Monday, is that he had that famous statement as, "I've had a dream." And in 1963, he delivered that message to more than 200,000 listeners at Lincoln Memorial following the Civil Rights March on Washington. King's dream was that his 4 little children would grow up to be, not to be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. That black and white children in Alabama would join hands and walk together as brothers and sisters. That racial segregation would cease and all peoples would be of one. But 5 years later, a sniper's bullet ended King's life, and he never saw his dream come true, and he was only 39 years old. We all live at times with shattered dreams. A young man dreams of becoming a commercial airline pilot, but his eyesight isn't good enough, so he's rejected. A student applies for an Ivy League university, but doesn't get accepted. I don't know if this mic is on or not. Can you give a little bit more volume? Okay. A student applies for an Ivy League university but doesn't get accepted, or a girl falls in love and is eager to marry her boyfriend, but he breaks off the relationship. Or leukemia takes the life of a little boy and his parents never see him grow into a man. Or a young woman becomes pregnant and is not able to see the baby to full extent, even being born, because of a miscarriage. An entrepreneur has confidence that his new business will be successful, but the public just doesn't buy into it. So many times comes our way, and probably all of us at times have had times that we've just had shattered dreams. One person who had seemed to live his dream was Pastor Robert H. Schuller. I had the opportunity of going to the Crystal Cathedral and seeing that place back in the 80s, and I was just amazed at what a huge facilities that he had built. But he testifies, he says, "I was born at the dead end of a dirt road that had no name or no number." From there, Schuller went on to become one of the most successful pastors with the 10,000 membership Crystal Cathedral, whose services were broadcast all over the world on the Hour of Power television program. Yet even Schuller admits that while growing up, he yearned to hear his mother say, "I'm proud of you, Bob," but she never said it. In the final chapters of Romans 15, the Apostle Paul shared his dream to preach the gospel in Spain. The Bible records, though, no such visit, and the best guess is that Paul never made it to Spain. So what can we do when we live with shattered dreams and expectations? I believe we can see some truths that verses 23 through 33 can give to us, or clues that if we're willing to able to get them, will help us through those times. So the first truth I want to be able to give to you today is remember that God is sovereign. Being sovereign is that he's above all others. He's a supreme being in all that we do. And he's in control of our lives. in good times and in bad. The Apostle Paul begins to say in verse 23, chapter 15, he says, "But now that there is no more place for me to work in these regions, and since I have been longing for many years to see you, I plan to do so when I go to Spain." Paul wanted to minister in Spain because there was no one else that had taken the gospel that far yet. And it was a great missionary frontier that day. Paul did 3 missionary frontiers, if you will. He took the gospel, did 3 different journeys of traveling, not the way we travel today. It was long haul through ship and through walking a lot and traveling in caravans of probably of animals, not of vehicles. And so it was quite a sacrifice to go on those ventures. But Paul confidently wrote, it's not when I go to Spain or if I go to Spain. He says, I will go to Spain. He didn't say, Lord willing, I will go, or I plan to go, or I hope to go. He was positive that God was going to use him to bring Christ to the unevangelized people. But he was wrong. God doesn't always send us where we want to go. I know some missionaries that felt God calling them as a young couple, and so they sold their house out in California, and they packed up everything they did, and they went over to missions. Their children separated apart. They separated apart. They came back broke, divorced, and their family spread to ruins. What happened to that time that they were so sure that God wanted them to go on the mission field to the time that they came back broken? I don't know. I don't know all that what happened. But sometimes our dreams can become broken, just broken up. And we wonder what happened and why, God. Paul added, I hope to visit you while passing through and to have you assist me on my journey after I have enjoyed your company for a while. Paul wanted to get the Roman church involved in his missions trips to Spain. He was asking the believers to help him finance his trip. He was asking them for offerings to be able to provide for the vision that God had given to him. And he wanted to send some of their own members to travel with them so that they would experience with the missions that he was on, like our group goes to the Dominican Republic, and we've gone to many other countries as a church. There's something that happens when we go out of our own surroundings and allow God to just take us into uncharted waters for our own. We had a group that our young people went to Africa, and we have a group that goes to different places that just is something God does when we get out of our own comfort zones. The Roman Christians would have had a life-changing experience if they would have been able to go on Paul's planned trip, but it derailed. His trip to Rome was far from being a stopover on his way to Spain. It resulted in a dead-end prison term of at least 2 years, we read in Acts 28. Someone might say, well, that must have been the devil, not God. But a Christian missionary and his son died in a private plane crash. And someone came to his wife's home and said, one thing you can be sure of, that God had nothing to do with that accident. It was all work of Satan. But I don't always believe that it's always works of Satan, and to be able to say that. Jesus said a sparrow can't fall to the ground apart from the will of our Heavenly Father. But a plane crash with Christians on board, can that be part of God's will? It makes no sense. And a lot of things on this side of heaven sometimes will not make sense to us. We won't understand and know the reasons. And sometimes it's only left to God's sovereign plan. That his plan is beyond what we can see, because we just see in such a tunnel vision. Paul didn't make it to Spain, and that was God's sovereignty. That means that he's in control no matter what happens. We can't always make sense this side of heaven, but we have to have faith that God's sovereignty is over our lives. There is a movie that was written, The End of the Spear, and if you've never seen that movie, It's of Jim Elliot. It is an incredible movie of a young man who just had the courage to go on a missions field. He said this quote, and it was echoed throughout the world. And he said, "He is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain which he cannot lose." He is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose. Well, his wife, Elizabeth Elliot, became a widow because he was killed on the mission field. They drove across on planes in Ecuador, and they drop out gifts of this group, of a tribal group in Ecuador. And they thought that they kind of made friendly terms with them. When they finally landed the plane, I think there was 8 to 10 of them, maybe about 8 or 6 to 8. The warriors came and they killed them right on the spot. But Elizabeth Elliot, in her 20s, even though her husband was killed, several years later, returned to Ecuador to reduce the tribe's language into writing so that they could have a Bible. 8 months of working with them, she left and entrusted her files to a colleague. But they were stolen, and Elizabeth said this: "I simply had to bow to the knowledge that God was his own interpreter. We must allow God to do what he wants to do." And if you're thinking that you know the will of God for your life, and if you're anxious to do that, you probably are in for a rude awakening. Because nobody knows the will of God and for his entire life. When we do graduation, we have those that are graduating from high school, and you kind of hear their dreams and expectations. And some of them have pretty lofty goals. But the reality of it probably is that very few of them ever really reach that at that age where they think they're going to end up at, because of whatever happens in their life, in their life's journey. God's sovereignty is when we put our hope in him, and as he leads us, that's where the sovereignty comes from. That he makes no mistakes, and he has a purpose in everything. All we have to do is to trust in him. Trust and obey, for there's what? No other way to be happy in Jesus. To trust and obey. John Henry Newman once said, "If I am in sickness, my sickness may serve Christ. If I'm perplexed, my perplexity is to serve him. If I'm in sorrow, my sorrow may serve him. My sickness or my perplexity or sorrow may be necessary causes for some great purposes which is quite beyond me. God does nothing in vain." At the end of Paul's life, he must have wondered why God didn't allow him to minister in Spain. Maybe he never received an answer to that question, except that his sovereign God was in control of his life. I would say that a lot of his writings that we received in the Bible was during those times of his imprisonment. And he became one of the focal points, and he reached way beyond Spain to even you and I today because of the writings and the time that he had and he wrote in those times that where he was imprisoned and in jail. He did some incredible writings that today affects you and I today and part of the New Testament. He became the author of, I believe, oh gosh, I knew the number at one time, but now I can't. 26 books in the New Testament. I don't know how many. I used to know that by heart, and now it just slipped my mind. But Paul's life was not wasted, even though his dreams were not reached. When we come and have shattered dreams, the second point I want to make today is that the focus on ministry God has given to us now is what's important. It means what God is doing in your life right now is what you need to focus on. Not what tomorrow holds, but what does today hold? in Romans 15:25 through 26, the missionary journey to Spain wasn't the next stop on Paul's planned itinerary. He went on to explain, "Now, however, I am on my way to Jerusalem in the service of the saints there. For Macedonia and Achaia were pleased to make a contribution to the poor among the saints in Jerusalem." So Paul could have sailed directly west to the Mediterranean through the sea to Spain. But his journey to Jerusalem would take him 1,000 miles in the opposite direction. And that would mean that it would be a 2,000-mile round trip. It was a detour before he could go to Spain. So there must have been something very important for him to make that journey to Jerusalem. And it was. It was all about Paul bringing a love gift from the Gentile Christians to the poverty-stricken Jewish Christians in Jerusalem. There was quite a sacrifice for those that became Christian and left their religion because they were considered outcasts. They were no longer part of the family and they were looked down upon. And so there was great poverty among the first Christians there. So Paul, on his third missionary journey to various cities in Europe, he collected from each of the congregations there portions of his love offering to be able to bring back. Paul knew how the poor Christians were in Jerusalem. In 2 Corinthians 11:27, he testified that he had often gone without food and been cold and naked. Then he knew firsthand experiences what it was to be in need. In Philippians, he talks about, "I've been in plenty and I've been in need, and I know both of them." In our human nature, we tend not to feel compassion for hurting people until we've kind of hurt as they do. Sometimes you don't have the same compassion towards someone until you've had to live through that same experience. And so Paul experienced hardships and trials, and he realized that hardships and trials, sometimes God purposed in our life that we'd be able to have compassion on maybe someone else that he was bringing us into a relationship with. So Paul was a perfect spokesman to ask the Gentile believers in verse 27 to be able to take an offering from them. He says, "We're pleased to do it, and indeed they owe it to them, for the Gentiles have shared in the Jews' spiritual blessing. They owe to the Jews to share with them their material blessings." Paul was asking them to be able to give a blessing above and beyond, to be able to, as we take our tithes and our offerings. Last week we asked for a free will offering to be able to give to a couple that wanted to adopt and bring a family from overseas. And sometimes we have speakers in and we call it a free will offering. It's not an expected thing. You're just giving out of your heart to be able to bless that person. Well, Paul started this back then, and he was able to take the Christians and the Gentiles, because he felt he was a missionary to the Gentiles, that he was able to say, if the Jews can help put the gospel in the Gentiles' heart, then the Gentiles owe it to the Jews to put a few dollars into their pockets and into their lives. Here's the principle. God is telling us that if someone has been a blessing to us, we're under an obligation to be a blessing back to them and to others. What God has been able to give you. See, we love, the unconditional love is that because God loves me, I can unconditionally love you, no matter if you love me back or not. And somehow there's something in our giving that God gives us the ability that we see needs, and as Christians, we give to those needs. We're a people of generosity. It doesn't make sense, but that's just part of I believe, the Spirit of God that he gives us, is that we want to give, we want to serve. Now, to the world, that's foolishness. You're crazy to do that. Because most of the world is very selfish and it's all about me. But God says, no, it's not about you, it's about others. And so when we were able to receive all that Jesus has done for us and realize, and what Paul was trying to have the first church there realize, is that what you have came out of the Jewish roots. It came out of what God started with them, and now you've been entrusted with this wonderful blessing of being able to call the children of God, that now it's expanded to you, that now you're a root, you're a branch that's coming out of the root. And he was saying, bless them back because they're in need. Paul continued in verse 28. So after I have completed this task, and I have made it sure that they have received this fruit, I will go to Spain and visit you on the way. Paul was eager to go to Spain, but he wouldn't do it till after he completed this task. Interesting enough, he felt he wanted so much to give this blessing, this money to the church. He wanted it so much. Why? I believe because Paul was called to the Gentiles. And you got to remember that in the book of Acts, they were saying, well, what about these Gentiles? They're coming to the Lord. And in Acts 15, it talks about, well, do they need to all be circumcised? Don't they have to follow the rules of what we believe as Jews and what we do to be acceptable? And they had to work through all these things. So there was a lot of mistrust in how this thing is going to all work out, because the Jewish Christians only knew one way. They knew how to be a Jew, and to live by the expectations and the laws that they lived under. And it was a tremendous trying to break out of that to really understand their relationship with God. And they were also probably pretty proud because they were the first, in a sense, chosen of breaking out. Now they're following after Christ. Paul felt compelled that he needed to first finish this task before he took on the other task of going to Spain. He followed through with what he felt he needed to do, and he didn't just jump, in a sense, what he felt the Lord was having him to do. He didn't bounce around from one thrill to another that we see so much about what people do today. He felt that God had called him to do a certain task, and before he went on to his vision, he completed that one task that he felt that God had him to do. He didn't start a new project until he had finished the first one of delivering this love gift. Paul made a request of the Romans in verse 30. He says, I urge you, brothers, by the Lord Jesus Christ and by the love of the Spirit, to join me in my struggle by praying to God for me. Here, Paul, a giant of the faith, but he still needed prayer support from other Christians. I hope that you as a church pray for me as the pastor and our leadership, that you pray for our church and pray for our Sunday school teachers, that regularly we be part of what you pray for, because if Paul needed prayer and asked for prayer, I certainly do. And we do as a church. Here's in verse 31 was his two prayer requests, that he may be rescued from the unbelievers in Judea. He was making himself vulnerable to persecution by the unbelieving Jews. They consider him a heretic who had deserted the Jewish religion, and so they believed he deserved to die, and he was going back into that. We know from the account of Acts, when Paul came to Jerusalem, there was Jewish rioters who tried to beat him to death. Others shouted, rid the earth of him. He's not fit to live. They almost led him to a flogging. And the Jews formed a conspiracy, and they bound themselves with an oath not to eat or drink until they had killed Paul. Paul was not going to a feel-good meeting. He wasn't coming to a war. He was coming with much danger against his life. But he felt so compelled to be able to complete a task that he felt God put on his heart. In Romans 15:31, he also prays that my service in Jerusalem may be acceptable to the saints there. You see, the apostle feared, and here's the other part he wanted the church to pray for. He feared that the pride might prevent the Jewish Christians from accepting offerings from the Gentile brothers that he had collected for them. It's as this, and I was trying to think of a good word picture to give here. It's as if you as parents were going through the hard time, and then your own children saw that you're going through a whole time, so they got together and got some money together to help you pay your bill. Well, as a parent, that'd be pretty hard to accept from your children, that you're there for them, not them there for you. You know, and so in a sense, they felt that the church has been extended through them to the Gentiles. It was very hard because of their pride to be able to receive something back. But Paul saw such a divine moment that if they would receive this gift and this blessing that would connect the Gentiles to the Jews, that they were having such a hard time. And so, yes, it was hard for them to be able to receive it, but as they received that blessing, there would be a connection to one another because they just wanted to be a blessing back to them. And there was a sense, there was a part of saying that we want to honor you with these gifts, church, and these gifts that we want to be part of the family, and we're together working through this thing. So Paul delivered this offering to Jerusalem, and it delayed his mission to Spain, but he felt so compelled to do that. But in a sense, in doing that, he somehow lost his opportunity to be able to do the dream that he had of evangelizing the lost in Spain. And was I saying that you shouldn't dream and do what you think the Lord wants you to do in the future? No. Dream big. Think about how God can use you and as you make yourself available to him. But don't let the future blind you to the work that God has given you for the present. And sometimes as things are worked out in the present, it's not so much a shattered dream, but God takes you to another direction or another opportunity. How many times do you go to college and you think that I'm going to get this degree? If you ask most people that have gone to college, they've probably changed at least 3 times they've changed what their major is going to be. And each one is a whole nother direction. God, in a sense, as we gain more knowledge and we learn of more things, and you know, what we thought when we were 20, even though we're looking at the same things, changes when we're 40 because we have a whole, and then when you're 60, it changes because we have a whole nother life perspective on sometimes the same thing, right? And God does the same thing in us. As he moves us and directs us in a certain way, there's sometimes changes that take place that it changes. But as we look at the present and we look at saying, God, in the present, I'm serving you. In the present, I'm available for you to use. In the present, I want you to be my everything. Not tomorrow, but today. And in that, we can go to the third point when we come against shattered dreams. Enjoy the blessing God has for you now. It's an important principle. Enjoy the blessing, because we get so caught up on the negative. We get so caught up in the, it's not fair, I can't believe all this is happening. We get so wrapped up on the 20% of our life, which is very difficult and hardship, that we lose sight of the 80% of our life that is things that are going pretty well. You know, and we get so caught up in what's right in our face than maybe sometimes looking at what the whole picture, what's happening in our lives. In verse 29, he says, after he would deliver the money to Jerusalem Christian, the apostle looked ahead at returning to Rome on his way to Spain. He goes, I know that when I come to you, I will come in the full measure of the blessing of Christ. Would you call yourself a blessing to others? It's not proud to say this, because the blessing doesn't come from us. It's the blessing of Christ that lives in us, and therefore it comes to us in full measure because of the God that's in your life. F.B. Myers said this. He said, whatever blessing is in your cup, it is sure to run over. In Psalms 23:5, it says, you prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. What is your cup overflowing with? As you bump in, if you think of a cup being so full that if you just wiggle it, it'll start spilling out. Sometimes I get my coffee overfilled that way, you know. After I put the creamer in, it's like, oh boy, I've got myself an issue here. Because if I touch something, it's going to spill out. We should be so full of God that when we bump into somebody, we should be spilling out the blessing onto them. But what's in your cup that comes out? What is it that they hear as you bump into people? In the world, it's always negative in the world, and it's criticizing, and it's sarcastic. When I hear Christians being, every sarcastic, it's not of the Lord. We tend to want to view things and say, you get people together and you say, oh, well, tell me 10 negative things. Bang, they give you 100. Well, give me 5 positive things. And they're thinking, they can't come up with positive things. They're so negative and sarcastic about things. I believe that God wants us to be a blessing to others because Christ in us, the hope of glory. And if even before our enemies, in the presence of our enemies, you anoint my head with oil and my cup overflows. And as much as I am preaching this to you, I got to take this in for me, okay? With our father, the calf is always the fatted calf. In Luke 15:23, bring the fatted calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. F.B. Myers also said, the robe is always the best robe. In Luke 15:22, he says, but the father said to his servants, quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put the ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. How many times you feel because of your sin, because of your wandering, because your lack of whatever it may be, because you've lost that closeness with God, that you feel like I don't deserve it, I'm not worthy. I'd say to you that God says, bring the fatted calf and let's celebrate. And let's quick bring the best robe and let's put it on him and honor him. Let's put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet because you're deserving. You're my child. And God is saying that to you. If you're here and you're struggling in certain areas, God is saying to you, I honor you and I want to give you my best. In 1 Peter 1:8, joy is inexpressible. Though you have not seen him, you love him. And even though you do not see him now, you believe in him. And you are filled with an inexpressible, glorious joy. And then there's a peace that passes all understanding in Philippians 4:7. The peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ. And the grace is so abundant that we have all sufficiency for all things and bound in every good work. In 2 Corinthians 9:8, it says, however it is written, no eye has seen, no ear has heard, no mind has conceived what God has prepared for those who love him. God's generosity to us is sometimes just as far as away of us being able to just receiving that from him. Some of these verses in the past I would put up as in the bathroom of when I was younger. I'd put it in the bathroom, and I'd always be looking at those scriptures of the promises of God and the blessings of God. And as I would prepare myself for the morning, I'd be able to see those scriptures, and they're encouraging to start the day with understanding my place with God. Every Christian can bring the full measure of blessing of Christ to others, just as Paul did to the Romans. We don't have to settle for less. We can settle for God's best. And the greatest blessing God can give us is to make us a blessing to others. God has blessed me richly, and now I want to be a blessing to other people. I want every day, I want to pray that God will make me a blessing to someone, somewhere. That when people bump into me, that somehow I can speak life and seed life into them. Do I do that constantly? No. I don't. But that's my goal. That's my goal. And that's what I need to be reminded of. Romans 15:32, Paul's blessing includes joy in his heart. And with confidence, he says, by God's will, may I come to you with joy together with you and be refreshed. I love guys, and some of you may not know the name, but he comes here, and Lou Gosleth, and we have him speak through the. I love having him in my home. He is just, Lou and Thelma, they're so positive, and they look at everything in such a positive way. And when you're around them, you just get blessed because it just rubs off on you. And I love to have people around me that way, that when you're around them, you get encouraged and you get built up. You don't come like you feel like you've been sapped of, all your energy and strength and your joy. There's some people that are just joy suckers. You get around them and it's like they're sucking on a lemon, and they just suck the joy right out of you. And if you're like that, quit it. I don't like being around you. Now, none here this morning are that way. I probably wouldn't say that if there was, but if it is you, okay, change it. We should be a people that when we get around others, they see something in us that makes us want to be around them more. And if you're around people and all you do is talk about you and your problems and your stink, quit it. We don't want to hear about your stink. We all have stink. Just go do your own laundry, and when you come back, present Christ. And let me hear the aroma of Christ through your life, not all your stinkiness. Can we grow up, church? I mean, that's just being a mature Christian. But so many times we come by and, I might get in trouble here. I went to find Tom because Tom was supposed to start the meeting. And I go in the Sunday school room and I go, oh boy, it stinks. Someone's got to do something here. The baby had dirty diapers, and Tom, so I started the service and he had to go do a little changing. Well, some of you need to change your diapers because you stink, man. And change it before you come to church. Just kidding. Okay. Paul, even though he had opportunities, unlimited opportunities, he thought he had smooth sailing now that he was going to go, but little did he realize in Acts 27, it talks about that he was involved in a shipwreck. He became a prisoner and remained under arrest for 2 years. But Paul would still say, he said, Paul, and here's the mindset. Here's his heartbeat. Here's his life belief system. Here's the core of what Paul was. He says, Paul came with joy. He knew God had a purpose in everything that happened to him. And if you bumped into him, regardless if it was probably just, he would have a joy that was inexpressible because he wanted to share the most important thing of his life, his relationship with Jesus. Paul was like a king's servant who always said, this is good, no matter what happened to him. And one day, accidentally, there was a servant that worked for the king, and he accidentally chopped off his finger, and it got into the food of the king. And the king was watching him cut the meat in the kitchen. So the king got so mad at him for making such a mess that he threw him in prison, in the dungeon. And the servant still said, well, I guess this is good. And the king thought to himself, he'll take those words back when he's been in that dungeon for a while. A year later, the king was traveling to Africa, and the cannibals kidnapped him. And they took him back to their village, and they were about to boil him in hot water. And when the chief spoke up and said, I have only one finger, or the servant, I have only one finger missing, and my body isn't perfect. So we can't eat him. The king said that, the village king said that about this other king. And so they let this king go that got his finger cut off by his cook. And the king realized that his servant had saved his life by accidentally cutting off his finger when he was preparing him the meal. And so the king apologized to his servant when he got back, and he goes, I'm sorry that I put you in dungeon. That's the worst thing I ever did. And the servant replied this, no, it was good that you threw me in the dungeon, because if I'd been with you in Africa, I would have became the cannibal's dinner. So often we can't see the purposes of God. And sometimes we just need to share in the blessings of God's joy in the present and in the now. Paul concludes in verse 33 that the God of peace will be with you. Will be with you all. And that was the mindset of Paul. The enemies of peace are all around us, and they're inside us. Anger, pride, jealousy, resentment, discouragement, disappointment. all those are enemies that try to just suck the joy of our life and the peace of our life. But if we know the God of peace, we can enjoy the peace of God. If we know the God of peace, we can enjoy the peace of God. I want to close with this story. As I mentioned earlier today, Jim Elliot in the story, it's a movie called The End of a Spear. If you haven't watched it, it's a great movie. I encourage you to. But this morning there was Jim Elliot's brother named Bert. He's the hero that we've never heard of. And there was a book that was written that was called Finding an Extraordinary God in an Ordinary Life. And it gave the example of Jim Elliot as an example of what faithfulness, or his brother Bert, was an example of faithfulness over a lifetime of events. It was a reminder how we could be steady light for a gospel no matter where God has placed us. Jim Elliot, as I mentioned before, is an amazing account of courage and faithfulness of the gospel. Jim became convinced that God's will and purpose for his life is to push back the darkness in the world by preaching the gospel where it had never been preached before. And in that time, he wanted to reach the unreached people of Ecuador. And as you know the story, that they were killed and the members that were with him were all killed. And his wife went back and worked within that same area and worked with the same people. But on January, that happened in 1956. And in his life, for Jim Elliot, even though it was a short-lived life, thousands upon thousands of people committed themselves to the work of the gospel overseas and to missions because of Jim Elliot's life. Well, what about Jim Elliot's brother named Bert? Interesting story about him. He was the one who isn't famous. He was a student at Multnomah Bible College in 1949, and he and his young wife were invited by missionaries to come to Peru and join the work there. Other than the occasional furlough back to the States, they have stayed. Now in their 80s, they are still living there. According to the writer of this book, he says, over the years, Bert and Colleen have planted more than 170 churches, and they were asked to reflect on their brother Jim's life. And he responded this way: my brother Jim and I took different paths. He was a great meteor, streaking through the sky, but Bert was not. He did not go streaking through the sky, and nobody lined up with their telescopes to watch his life. Instead, he was that faint star in the distance that faithfully rises night after night, always there, always faithful, always doing the same thing, always the same boring thing. Now think on this for a moment, and I'm closing with this. Streaking meteors and faithful stars. In the kingdom of God, there's great need for streaking meteors. But most of us won't be that. We instead will be that fainting stars. Husbands and fathers and wives and mothers will be accountants and teachers and business people and students. We'll go through life day after day doing very much the same thing tomorrow of what we did today. But the important thing for us to remember is that we are all needed together. There's a great need for people willing to chase the littles of this life. It's not very exciting. They believe in the constant presence and the purpose of God for every day. And they're willing to stand in the midst of the boring, convinced that there's no such thing as ordinary as we follow an extraordinary God. You see, you may not reach the big dream that you have, but in the midst of today, I want to challenge you, church, that you rise and stand. And then tomorrow, rise and stand again. Be faithful to the calling that God has called you to. Live with the constant presence of God in your life and the purposes of God in your life today. We may not be that big flash, but we can be a steady working that God will use to work his purposes through you and I. Let's stand together in a word of prayer. Hi, I'm Pastor John McConnell, and I'd like to welcome you today for watching our program. It's just amazing the technology we have today that we're able to live stream all around the world. And we'd like to give you an opportunity, if you'd like to give towards this ministry, you can go online and be able to follow the directions that are on there and be able to give to the ministry that you've been watching. So God bless you. We thank you for being part of Southside Alliance Church today.